back. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.
We can work it out. We can work it out.
We are back, and this is Boomer Life. I'm George Gordon. Today, we're talking about the changing perceptions and living well with Parkinson's disease. With the Parkinson Society, British Columbia CEO Jean Blake. Also joining us, neurologist Dr. Silke Cresswell, and UBC researcher and PhD candidate at Seg3, and Richard Mayade, a person with Parkinson's, what we call a PWP. That's what you're called. We'd like to welcome you, Richard,
Sure.
for joining us and sharing your story. You are described as a filmmaker, digital designer, brainstormer, positive doer. Tell me, what were the first signs of Parkinson's disease that you noticed?
Well, initially affected my left side, which is my dominant side. And what actually was a friend that noticed it first for me, and I kind of ignored her, as typically men do when women tell them what's going wrong. But thanks to her, like really pushing me to get it checked by a doctor, that I finally saw my family doctor, and after several visits with him, finally saw a neurologist. And making a long story short, I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. But because I was only 37 at the time, that neurologist suggested that I go to UBC, to the Pacific Parkinson's Institute, and get a second opinion. And sure enough, my current doctor, Dr. McEwen, confirmed the initial neurologist's diagnosis. And so again, for me, it wasn't so much of a shock. I was kind of preparing myself for it. Like I thought, well, the best case out of all the potential things that it could be was that, well, if it's going to be anything, it's probably best that it's Parkinson's. And so I kind of prepared myself for that.
What was the gut reaction though when they told you?
Well, honestly, only for like a brief millisecond, I was really shocked and disappointed, right? But because of the fact that I was brought up to be very positive, and that really, the fact that that I had this illness now is just, for me, from that point forward, I just decided I have to make the most out of it and be a source of positive encouragement.
That's an interesting point. We often hear when people are dealing with any disease or condition, you have to keep a positive attitude. Well, it's always easy until it's you, but
Yeah.
But you have exemplified. You've got a great sense of humor, and you're also using Twitter to talk about some of the situation, like some of the frustrations. How would you like to share some of those with us?
Well, it's only recently that some of the frustrations have really started to take a hold, and so the fact that I'm tripping up at times and some shuffling, it's been a source of frustration because of the fact that I used to be a sprinter back in my university days, right? So having been someone who ran fast, now being slowed down, it's been a bit of an ego crush. But again, I have friends that have been really encouraging. They just tell me, you're getting older. Yeah, that's all that's happening. Yeah.
Well, you talked about some of the changes that you're going through, and you're cognizant of what's going on. What are some of the good things that you found about dealing with the disease? Exercise?
Definitely exercise. The fact that I participated in a study, and for me, just the fact that riding my bike, running, playing sports, like staying as physically active as possible has really helped me in terms of like just overall good feeling. And that I think goes without saying, regardless of whatever illness or condition. I think exercise is really key to long-term health.
Right.
Yeah.
I noticed that you use walking canes. We see a lot of people use, and for striding, it gives you better balance. Has that made a huge difference? I mean, were you ever told that, well, you know what, you should maybe not try and walk, or were you always, the people that were helping you, were they always encouraging you to get out and stay more active?
Well, it is something that has always been part of me, that like I want to take control of this rather than it taking control of me. So the walking sticks really do help me because it kind of motivates me to keep my arms moving forward because they tend to stay still, right? So it's something that I have to be cognizant of and keeping my momentum moving forward. So that's why I'm using the walking sticks.
I see, you know what, I see more people with, not people, just people with Parkinson's that are of all walks of life using them. What a great tool they've become. Now you are also a digital designer. You're a filmmaker. Are you still able to work with your passions in what you do in work life?
Very very much so. What I found that's quite interesting is that because after I've found out that I had Parkinson's, one of I think the side effects has been that I've become much more creative, and so it's kind of a weird thing, but I just found that my creative output's just skyrocketed since. So it's been a benefit actually.
Does that be you focus more, or is it just you don't? Is it the psychological? Well, that's a second thought. No, that's an idea. Let's run with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's something that's really I found that my writing has become much more something that I've
the colors come out, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. How has ParkinsonSocietyBC helped you?
Well, how it initially helped me was like at the very beginning. I participated in for a conference for newly diagnosed patients, and that really helped me to get an idea of what it is that I'm facing. And having heard a couple of people talk from their experience of having Parkinson's, that helped me to see what it is that I'm going to be dealing with, and so that's the initial help that I got from BC Parkinson's.
Well, you sound like the role model for positivity and that making a difference in your life. If you had one thing to tell somebody who was just diagnosed with this, what would you say to them?
I would say that that it's not as bad as one may think it's going to be. When I first got it, I thought, well, it's going to be really rough after 10 years, right? But this is 11 years now into my illness, and I'm still doing quite well considering. So I think that maintaining a positive attitude is really key to battling this illness.
Excellent. Yeah. Richard, thank you. Dr. Gressel, maybe we could go back to you for just a bit. We've talked a bit about now the exercises that can be done, but the positive effects I don't think can be downplayed. It's not just incidental.
No, not at all. And in the clinic, I see this really every day, exactly as you describe it. The people who take exercise seriously, I often say, you know, exercise is your new job. The people who take exercise seriously do so much better in the short term as well as in the long term. And I think Matt will speak to that, what the underlying mechanisms are, what we think the underlying mechanisms are, since they're only just being figured out. It certainly is positive on many different levels. There's the physical aspect of it, just the fitness aspect, because we know, of course, it has positive effects on the heart, on the muscles, weight, on bones, on all these things. But I'm sure it is psychological. In one of the studies that you actually participated in, that you ran and that we did together, people after one single bout of exercise actually had better mood for the rest of the day, and they were also moving better. Then I'm sure Matt will talk about that. So it has the kind of mechanism that influences your mood and makes it better, but it's also something you can do. It is something where you have control and where you are active, rather than sitting back passively and being fed something, you know, the medication, but you take control. And that is really also what we do with the medication. With the medication, we try to enable this level of activity. This is exercise, and it's varied exercise, so anything from aerobics, so getting your heart rate up, getting somebody to break out in a sweat, as well as balance, stretching, strengthening exercises, but also activity on the social level and on the cognitive level. So exactly, you're just exemplifying that. So everything you've just described, you want people to be out there We want people to mix with others, to keep going with their activities and interests. And that, I think, is really what keeps people well. And that makes it possible to live well with this condition. Now, there are some people where this is more challenging than for others, just because, as I said, it is a very individual disease, so it'll affect people differently and with different degrees of severity. But if I look across the clinic, the people who exercise do just hands down better. Of all the things I would recommend, this is, obviously you need the medication on board, but exercise is really the pillar to live well with it.
Terrific. All right, then let's stay on that thought. And we bring in researcher and PhD candidate at Seg3, who is doing current research on exercise and Parkinson's disease. What are you finding? What are the connections that you found in beating this disease as we can?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the show, George. Exercise is a phenomenal treatment that we can use for exercise. The thing about that we see in the research is that it works, and we know it works, but no one understands why it works. So we're trying to understand the mechanisms that undermine exercise so we can get at better therapeutic avenues for Parkinson's disease. So the study that Richard participated in, the one that Dr. Cresswell alluded to, we were trying to look at the electrical activity of the brain and compare it to the electrical activity of the muscles. And what we did is we took a group of people who had Parkinson's disease, and we took a group of people who didn't have Parkinson's disease, and we put them on a bike, and we had them exercise and cycle at different intensities. And we wanted to see if there's any similarities in brain activity and muscle activity or differences between these two groups. The first interesting thing that we found was that after a single bout, so just 15 minutes of exercise, the people with Parkinson's felt better, they had better movement, they had better cognition, so they overall felt better, and this was after a simple 15-minute bike ride. The interesting thing from the neurological perspective is that we actually saw a different brain pattern that was activated in people with Parkinson's disease. And we saw this despite similar muscle activities, so we think it could be potentially a compensatory mechanism that's occurring, but we still need to do some more research within this. So that was kind of our first initial finding, just looking at one single bout of exercise, what can actually change the brain and how can it actually help people with Parkinson's.
I understand there's all kinds of studies being done now that what you're working on, the 14 studies on just on treadmill training alone. What are you finding? I mean, that's fairly simple, I guess, that you can hang on and you can set your pace and so on. But again, it seems to be you get in with the good air, out with the bad air, and it seems oversimplified, but it does make that much of a difference.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's funny, when you look at exercise treatments in the literature, there's such a wide range of different therapies that claim to be beneficial. You know, one end of the spectrum, you have treadmill training or aerobic training. You have work by Dr. Jay Alberts down the Cleveland Clinic that's called forced exercise, and that's where they actually put someone on a tandem bike. So they'll have a person with Parkinson's on the back, and they'll have an elite cyclist on the front, and the person on the front will just be going as hard as they can, and the person on the back, the person with Parkinson's, is just kind of along for the ride, and they're forced to go a specific speed, and that claims to be beneficial. But then there's also one of the largest randomized control trials published in the New England Journal of Medicine was Tai Chi in Parkinson's, and they compared that to resistance training. They actually showed that Tai Chi was better for balance. And so you have two opposite ends of the spectrum. You have very high intensity and very low, more balance-based, and both of them seem to have benefit. So we're trying to understand is actually, instead of trying to identify the specific type or intensity that we should be exercising, if we can understand the mechanism, the changes in the brain, for example, then I think we can better understand what exercises we should actually be targeting.
How's the funding for all this research coming along? Or is that like dropping the grenade into the middle of the conversation, you know? Silky?
It's always a challenge. So there are funding bodies run by the government, the Canadian Health Research Institute, and getting funding is definitely a challenge. And as a researcher, you have to keep applying for funding on a very regular basis. And of course, jobs from people on the team depend on that. If you can't get a grant, if it isn't funded, and only a small minority of grants are being funded, then that has implications for your whole center and for your operations. That often makes it difficult to really plan well ahead. You really have to often plan project by project. The Parkinson's Society is fortunately also engaged in supporting research, so that has been very helpful, and that is very good. Fortunately, at the Pacific Parkinson's Research Center, we also have a very active group of individuals, the Pacific Parkinson's Research Institute, who support research endeavors at our particular institution. That has been extremely helpful to also get pilot projects off the ground and to support a lot of the infrastructure that you just don't get grant funding for, but that you have to have in place in order to then run quite a few projects. We have one exercise project, and I'm sure Matt is going to talk about that, because this is a really big one, headed by Dr. John Stursall, and that was also funded by a private individual who is very interested in Parkinson's and exercise. So it's a mix, but it's always a struggle, and it's something that certainly keeps us on our toes as researchers, and we always hope it would be better and more predictable, and yeah.
Yeah, I'm fortunate enough that my 2 years of my research is funded by the Parkinson's Society Canada, so I was given a research grant as a graduate student, so I'm very fortunate for that. And then the project specifically that I'm working on was funded by one individual who was very interested in exercise and Parkinson's, and that came through the Pacific Parkinson's Research Institute. So without funding like that, it would be very difficult to do the research that we're doing. Yeah.
Something that both of you have talked about in understanding, getting down to the cell level of what might cause this disease and what might take it in a particular direction. So stem cell research, is that going to play a role in perhaps finding a cure for that, or is that seemingly the answer to everything, although it hasn't been yet?
Yeah, so there was a lot of hype around it, and I think we've learned a lot from those studies. Unfortunately, they are not at treatments that involve stem cells are certainly not at a point where we can use it in the clinic. There are still quite a few problems, including that Parkinson's isn't just affecting one cell population in the brain, but it really affects the brain more or less in its entirety. So you can't, unless you can regrow and reroot the whole brain, a single population of stem cells will only ever deal with one particular area of the problem. Then the stem cells also need to connect to the right centers, and what we've also seen is that some of those cells that were being implanted, now these are cells, fetal cells, so really brand new cells that should not have any of the protein that is clogging up cells in Parkinson's in them. And for some individuals who had received those stem cells, when they had died and they looked at the brain under the microscope, they saw these changes, these proteins that build up in Parkinson's, even in the new cells. So there is a hypothesis out there that what we call the prion hypothesis, where these protein accumulations seem to go from cell to cell to cell, and therefore even if you put new cells in, they might then be affected by this protein accumulation. So although we've learned a lot from stem cells, there are also still many obstacles that will need to be overcome, and I don't think it's going to be something in the near future that would be in the clinical realm. Unfortunately, we have quite a few people who see on the internet, there's stem cell therapies in Mexico and China and Germany and Poland and the US and various places that offer those for a lot of money, and people go there to get this treatment. And it is really not something that we as clinicians or researchers would recommend at this point at all.
Well, I guess if we're going to sum it up to this point, we don't know what causes it. We don't know what's going to cure it, but we sure are becoming much more aware of Parkinson's disease, how it can be treated, how people like Richard are using their positive way of thinking to take everything that's within their power to make their life full, meaningful, and not to be held back by this. Coming up, we're going to talk to some folks who have understood that song can help in more ways than one, and we'll talk about some of the problems that people who are dealing with Parkinson's must do in trying to cover all their costs. That's coming up on Boomer Life here on CIL 650.
celebrating the baby boomer lifestyle. This is Boomer Life on CL 650.